Hi, Denise here with Dolphin Delight Designs, and in this video I would like to share some casting resin tips that I've picked up over the years. This is not a how-to video on how to do resin. There's plenty of those out there already, so I don't think I need to do another one. Also, disclaimer, I am by no means an expert, but I've been using casting resin for about 7 years. And so I thought I would do a quick share of some of the tips that I've picked up during that time. And hopefully you'll find them somewhat helpful. First off, you can see that I have some different resins here. One of the questions we get asked, and people seem to have some confusion on, is the difference between coating resin and casting resin. I don't think that there's a big difference per se in the resin. I don't know enough to be able to tell you that. I do know that there's a different use though. So when you're talking about quick casting resin, you'll see here I have 2 boxes of Amazing. Amazing Cast is a pretty, Illuminite Amazing is a pretty popular brand, at least in the United States. And I think people sometimes get confused between the 2 different types. When you're looking at using resin to cast in the different molds, like your silicone molds, you know, like this or something like this, or, you know, the different silicone molds, you want to look for the casting resin. And you can, when you look at the box, even the front of the box doesn't really make it super clear, right? But look for the white picture, and on the back, and you'll see that it's got, you know, pictures where something's been cast in a mold, little casting pieces on the back. Whereas the clear casting, it shows you pictures of them kind of pouring it in a layer, and to create this high gloss sheen. Even on the back, it'll show you, you know, it's a clear resin. Again, you just have to kind of really read it very carefully. Another example could be art resin. This is another clear resin. That's not to say that these can't be used in molds. They can. They take longer to dry when you do them in a thick mold than the casting resin, the quick casting resin. They generally take, I believe, close to 24 hours for them to set. I have used them in these kind of molds. They're not my preferred, and I don't claim to have much knowledge on that, but I just kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit, between the difference between the casting and the coating resin. So a coating resin, you would have a picture already done or a mold, and then you would pour this over the top of it to create a thin coat that kind of seals it and gives it that high gloss finish. So on those, we'll get rid of these 2. There's a lot of different casting resins out there. And basically it boils down to preference. A couple of the more popular quick casting ones is the Amazing Casting Resin. Cures in about 10 minutes. Cures white. You can add color to it. I would suggest that if you're going to add a color, that you add a color specifically for resin, not something that you pick up off the shelf, or, you know, stuff like liquid acrylics can be added to resins, but I've not done it, so I don't have much knowledge in that, but I would just say that if you're going to experiment it, first use it with something that is made for the resin. The other resin that I use quite a bit is Casting Crafts Fast Cast. Kind of tongue-tied there. This is also white. I've gotten this before in black. Those are basically the 2 that I use the most. I know there's some different brands out there, and I'm not promoting any brand. Those just the ones that I find that are the easiest, and that I don't have issues with. Like, I don't have problems with it setting up. I don't have a lot of bubbles in it. They just seem to work the best for me. Again, it's a personal preference, but if I was just going to start out, I would say something like this to start out with. Okay. One of the other molds one of the other resins that I like to use is Zuri's water-based resin. This mixes a little differently. It's usually it can have some different ratios. Sometimes it's 2.5, but usually it's 1 part A and 2 parts B. Sometimes you might see it 1 part A and 2.5 parts B, depending on if it's the concrete or some of the other different types. I like this a lot. The one thing I would caution on is that it does not work well for intricate type molds. When you have these little areas that come out, it's not thick enough to hold it together, so it will break when you demold it, or break when you try to put it on something. It's just not as stable. If you're using something bigger, it tends to work pretty well. So this is an example of one done with a water-based resin. And you can tell because this is a big surface, it'll show the detail really well, right? But it's a big over surface, so it doesn't break. Now this part, you know, you would be careful when you're demolding this kind of area so that it wouldn't break. And I tend to pour these a little bit thicker than I would maybe the polyurethane resin. So that's it on the water-based. Okay, moving on. So we covered some of the different kinds of resin, by far not the majority of them. There are way too many resins to list and go over. This was just kind of touching on some very basic ones that are around, and the difference between some of them. When you get resin, so we'll go on to the mixing part of it. And I'm most of this video, I'll be talking most specifically about quick cast resin. It seems to be what a lot of us use. It's what I use 90% of the time, and the other 10% I use water-based resin. I'm impatient. I think most of us artists are impatient. So, you know, I want to pour my mold and be done in 10-15 minutes with it and be able to start using it to create my project. A lot of the times the boxes will come with these little cups. They're just little 2 tablespoons, 1 ounce cups, I guess. I think that says 1 ounce. So you can use those. You can use paper cups, which I use a lot of the time. You can use silicone cups. You can get these on Amazon or different stores. They're nice, you know, they're pretty easy to clean. So you can use several different items to use for your stirring. The most popular is a popsicle stick, right? Gets in here, stirs everything up. You can use coffee stirrers. I use both the plastic ones and the square kind of one. In fact, we'll use it on our coffee and I'll wipe it off and then let it dry and save it and use the other side for my resin. I save everything. Nothing is not usable. You want to keep something on hand, like with a sharp point, like toothpicks, or this is a skewer for kitchen cooking stuff. A cheap brush. This helps to kind of paint and get into the deeper parts of the mold when you have these intricate kind of details in there, or even better, the words. So you can use both the toothpick and this to push that resin down into that area. Another items that I keep on hand, old gift cards or anything that has a nice sharp edge, or something like this. This is used when you're laying vinyl to get it to lay down. Anything that's going to have kind of an edge to this. This you can use when you do over pours and you scrape it across the top of the mold. So they are always handy to have when you're getting ready to pour your resin. One of the things that you want to be sure of is that you don't pour big cups. when you're first starting out, you want to do small amounts. I wouldn't do more than 1 or 2 ounces at a time. It will start to, the chemicals will react to each other and start to harden in the cup before you get all the resin out. If you're pouring, you know, after you've done it for a while, you could lay several of these big pieces out together, mix it up, and quickly pour into the pieces before it has time to really set up together in the cup. And you're usually okay. But until you're used to working with the resin, I wouldn't waste my time. You'll just waste resin because it'll harden in the cup, and then you've wasted a whole half a cup of resin. And it's not cheap, so. I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but the best way is to use the scale to measure. You can do it, you know, half and like this, or 5-10 ounces. But really, the best way to do it is with the scale. It's going to give you the most accurate. I find that the Amazing Cast and the Fast Cast are pretty forgiving, but it's still resin, and it can be temperamental. You know, sometimes it just is temperamental. The temperature is not right, or something's not right, and, you know, you want to stack the deck in your favor, really. All right, so let's mix up a little batch. I'm going to, so one of the things when you're putting on a scale, you want to put your, whatever measuring device you're going to use on first. This comes in at 0.9 ounces, this cup, right? So you would want to get that to 0 before you start pouring your resins. Another reason why I like using the paper cups, because they're super light. You put it on there, there's no weight to it at all. And the only reason I'm actually pouring a resin on here is I wanted to demonstrate, one of the questions that we've had come up quite a bit is if you can use resin in a texture sheet. And you can. I use it quite a bit. There's quite a few people that don't feel like you can. But I find that I have absolutely no problem using it. So we're going to quickly stir, 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 stir. Another thing with the casting resin, you do not have to stir it as long as you have to with the coating resin or the clear resin. Very quickly, it's ready to pour. I just always want to make sure I get around the sides. And it usually will come to a clear color. You can't really see it in here, but when it's mixed together, it's usually clear. Not always, so that's not always the best thing to go by. So I've got here one of the Zuri texture, a couple of the Zuri texture sheets, and I wanted to show you how to do a couple of things. All right. So just randomly, for the texture sheets, I just randomly pour it on here. Not as much resin as I normally use. And here's the trick. You can take that handy dandy credit card, right? And just push it down into it, right? And same with this one. You're just going to push it. I kind of play with my resin. Don't be afraid of your resin. It won't hurt you, you know. So I push it down into the mold and kind of spread it around randomly. It does not have to go to the edge. You're using it as a texture sheet. You can even grab some. I didn't get as much over here as I wanted. And this is also where we talk about the painting. You can see that even though this is a self-leveling resin, it will still have bubbles in it. So you can take this paintbrush and kind of paint it into those letters and get some of that bubble out. Poke it down in there, right, as it's going along. And you're basically what you're trying to do is push that resin into those little tiny areas. And I find these paint brushes work really well for that. We've had people ask about that too. You know, Zuri is very detailed and has a lot of resins, or excuse me, a lot of molds that have lettering. And so people ask, how do we get the bubbles out of the letters? This is a good way to do it. Of course, the brush is not going to be any good later on, so that's why you want to use cheap ones. You can also, you know, poke. So that this goes down in there where you see bubbles coming up. And I'm just kind of doing it randomly on this. I've seen in the comments where people suggest using a heat gun on your resin. I can tell you that I've never done that. And I did some research on it just to kind of, you know, since I'd never done it. And what I've read is that it's not really the best thing to do. You could use this kind of heat gun, right? You know, kind of go over it. But you don't want to use the torch that you see a lot of them do with the other kind of resin. Those torches are extremely hot, and so the molds can withstand close to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Those torches put out 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit or more. So that's quite a bit more than the molds were designed for. So what will happen is they can break down. And then you've damaged your mold, right? Another thing you can do is lift them and tap them out. This just helps the resin kind of settle into, you know, into the little holes. So you can see that it's already starting to set up. See how it's starting to turn colors there? And you can feel the heat underneath. So we're going to move this aside. Another tip and trick here. To prevent your resin from hardening to your lid, I always clean mine off. Just take a paper towel or something and clean it off. And then I use the self-sealing saran wrap. So it's the stuff that's sticky on one side, and I make this to put over top of it. And then that way, when I put my lid on, next time I go to use it, it'll come off super easy. Before I picked that up from somebody, I would struggle. I'd be getting pliers out, all kinds of things, because sometimes the resin will harden the lid. And, you know, then you're stuck, right? You're trying to get your resin open and it won't get open. This also, by the way, is a good tip for paints. Paints, pastes, anything that once you crack that seal is open, you can use the self-sealing saran wrap. And I just cut a square out and put it on there. And I've had opened up pastes that I hadn't used for a year, and they were still good using that. So it's a great little tip and trick. Another one that I found super helpful, and I wish I'd had learned about earlier on. Oh, and baby wipes. We all know you got to have baby wipes with you, no matter what. And disclaimer, you should probably wear gloves. I never do, but you know, do as I say, not as I do. You should probably wear gloves when you're working with resin. This is odorless resin, so it doesn't really have a fume problem, but you probably wouldn't want to do a lot of it in a closed-in area. So great tip for cleaning up resin off of your molds, out of your cups, like when you're using a silicone cup. All of that is tape. I keep this in my art room. So it's good for packaging up your stuff when if you sell it and you're getting rid of it. But it's also great for cleaning up. when I read this online one time, it was one of those moments where I just was like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of that. So here's one of the cups, right? And I used black resin in there. And you just stick the tape inside and kind of get it around the sides, and it just pulls the resin out. And you just keep doing that until it grabs all that resin. Super easy to get that cleaned out of there. It'll work on little cups. So this is an old one, but I thought I would try it. So see how it just kind of pulls that resin right up? And these little cups, the resin will get in the little grooves where the words are. So inside, you know, and it won't come up. So sometimes it'll take a couple of pieces of resin to get that all cleaned out, but it will. It'll clean it all out and it'll be like brand new. It also works on molds. So here's my well-used little bit of everything mold. I mean, you know, I use this for a little bit of everything, right? So this tape will work great on cleaning up the resin bits. Because here's another tip. You don't want all these bits of resin in your sink. You don't want to take this and go scrub it out in your sink until you've cleaned the resin stuff off of it. It will gather in your pipes and clog it. And that's an expensive mistake to not have to worry about. You just take the tape and go through and it will pull off. These big pieces you can, you know, pick off. But this will get down in the mold and it will clean off mica. It'll pick off the resin from the molds. Like I said, the big pieces, it works really good for cleaning off the little stuff. See how it picks up. So like, let's look at the back of this one. I get a lot of these because another thing you can do with the scraping is if you over pour, which I didn't do on these, but if you over pour, you can use this tool or the credit card and come across it, right? And it's going to take all that excess resin and even make it go into another mold or just clean it off your blade. That way, when you're done, you don't have to try to cut and trim off a whole bunch of resin. It's already, right, leveled out for you. But it does leave this kind of residue behind. So you just, again, take this tape and it'll come off after a couple of times. This is pretty. So you just keep doing that. It gets, you know, the tape, you have to get a couple pieces of tape sometimes, but it is still by far easier than anything else I had tried until I came across this. So you can see it just comes right up. So that's a little cool little trick to clean up your molds. All right, where are we with this? Let's see what else we got. While these are curing, another thing that I see a lot in the chats is when resin fails, right? Unfortunately, for all of our better intents and our best efforts, sometimes it just doesn't work, right? So it's a couple of different ways it fails. Sticky resin, so that's a result of, it could be a result of not stirring it enough. Bad temperatures. I'm pretty lucky. I live in the States and I live in an area where it's pretty decent warm and it never gets really cold. So I don't ever have a problem with temperature on my resin, but I know some places do. So that can affect your resin setting up. And so you get this sticky kind of, oh my God, it's like it wants to mate with your mold. It won't come out. So some things you can use to clean that up. A Q-tip and some alcohol will work. It is time consuming. I'm not going to tell you that it's a super easy fix. It does take time to get it out of, you know, all the pieces in there. And a Q-tip's usually the best way to do it. I've seen hand sanitizer posted that they use that, which kind of makes sense. Alcohol and glycerin, you know, glycerin will help the mold, make it a little slick. Freezing, I've heard people say they put it in the freezer and that works. I'm not sure how well that works for resin. I know that it works for clay. I don't know how well it works for resin. And then sometimes your resin, I had this happen recently, the molds are bad. It does happen. In this case, I think I got a bad shipment because it was 2 molds from the same shipment. Poured my resin and it would not come out of the mold. In fact, it tore the mold. That has never happened to any of my Zuri molds, but doing things like heating your molds, like I was talking earlier with the torch, you need to let your mold rest after you mold something. You know, you pour a resin in a mold and you take your piece out. You need to let the mold sit for a while and kind of recuperate a little bit, right? So that it kind of settles back into itself. That'll help prevent the mold breaking down, because they break down over a long period of time. If you take care of your molds, they'll last a really, really long time, guys. I've had some of my Zuri molds for over 7 years, and they are still going strong. Some other brand names, again, I'm not going to get into brand names, but some other ones that I've had that are still going strong. And I'm not by any means fanatical about taking care of them. You just a little care, you know, and don't do things like heating them up or poking them with a sharp object, you know, because that'll put a hole in them, or overstretching them, like pulling and stretching when you're trying to get the mold out, you know, and bending it too far and just really kind of over extending it. All of that adds stress on it. Just think about it as any object. If you're, you know, doing all of this and twisting and all of that, it's eventually going to wear it down. So just if you're careful with it, I think you'll be good. When you're storing them, don't store them so that they're bent, right? Like, don't stack them on top of each other with different sizes, like having a small one and then a big one and then a small one and a different sized one, so that they're kind of hanging like this. You can't really see that, but like if they're hanging like this, right? Because that'll wear them down too. Don't store them in direct sunlight or near a heater, or in extreme cold. Like, you know, you don't want to, again, near the window if it's cold, or near the window. In a basement, if you have a basement and it's cold in the basement. I store mine flat or vertical. I have a couple of different storage systems. You know, you can store them vertical, right? So if they're all kind of stacked together. I also store mine in the cardboard. So that adds a little bit of strength to it too, right? So you can store it. Just adds a little bit of stability, especially to thin ones. Little things to think about. All right, let's see if we can get this out. It might still be too soft. Try this one. Okay. So when resin is not quite 100% stiff, right? It's still very flexible and bendy. And you take it out of the mold, you just want to work it, especially since I poured these very, very thin. But it's no different than trying to take, like if you use a paste, an acrylic paste or acrylic paint or gel medium or something like that in a mold, you know, you kind of have to work it to get it out of the mold. This one I poured a little thinner than I normally do because I was busy talking and not paying attention, but that's okay. We are going to get it out. All right, so we got most of it out. So this is what I have mentioned in the groups before. So this is a texture mold. It hasn't quite set up yet. It's bendy, right? It's nice and soft. You can tear it So you can tear it into pieces. You could cut it. So you can do pretty much anything you would with clay or pastes. What I like about resin is it's more durable. Meaning that once it dries, so when it does dry, it will be stiff. So you can mold it around an object, right? So you could take and mold it and glue it down just like that. Super easy. And the same thing with this. I might not take the whole thing out right now, but I'll get it started because I wanted to show you what the words look like. So I'm being impatient because I don't want to wait and take this all out while I'm on video. But here's the one with the words. So if you look at this very closely, I don't know if you can see that, but there's not a lot of bubbles in there. And that's because I took the paintbrush and painted it down. So you don't see, and these are really tiny words. And there's, you know, it gets rid of that. By using that paintbrush, it really gets rid of all of those little bubbles that resin can have. No heat needed. There's still some, you know, I mean, as with any resin, you'll still find some bubbles here and there, but I actually don't see any on this piece. So basically, it is possible to use the resin to do texture sheets. And again, it's flexible. Rip, tear, wrap it around an object, do whatever you want. Another tip is once resin's cured, it can be heated. So if you wanted to, find a piece. So this is a solid piece. It's got a little bit of bendy to it, not like, you know, it's not solid, but it's certainly not going to wrap around anything this way. But you can take your handy dandy heat tool and just heat up the resin. You don't want it to bubble, so don't like go crazy with it. You can test it. It won't be quite as flexible as when you first molded it, but you can bend it. So what was stiff before, we can now bend. And if you reheated the whole piece in different stages, you can, you know, you could bend it around. But see how now we can almost bend that flat just by reheating it. Now, this is harder to do if it's a super thick piece, like, I don't have one in front of me. Like maybe something that's thick like this, you're going to have a hard time getting that hot enough to bend. Just because it's so thick. You'll get part of it to bend, right? But you wouldn't get this to bend so much. I think the resin would start bubbling up because it will, you can overheat it and it'll start bubbling and burning. So, you know, just keep that in mind. You're not going to be able to reheat really thick pieces and bend those, but you can do the edges, right? So you could bend this around an object and this be just stationary. You can also, when you're, if you needed to cut this or cut the resin, heating it will make it very easy to cut. Like if you wanted to just use pieces of this instead of the whole mold, reheat it, take your razor blade and cut it. It's also very easy, of course now I can't find a razor blade. When the resin is in this state, it's easy to cut and trim. But if you're working on a piece that has little wispy pieces like this, see how this is? You don't want to take your razor blade in there then. It will cut into the piece because it's too flimsy. You want to wait for that to get hard and then trim around that with your blade because it's just too thin right now. You can do this on the big thicker, like if it was this piece, when it's nice and thin, that's a good time to use your razor blade and get it trimmed out, but not on the more delicate areas because it's just too flexible and flimsy at that point. Okay. Just checking to see if I got anything else here. So we talked about a little bit about cleanup. If you're not using a mat, so a silicone mat like this, you know, you can just bend it and the resin will pop off. If you're using, a lot of times I would use glass because glass is super easy to clean. Then you would just take a razor blade. I've got one of those wide razor blades that you use. I use it to clean the paint and everything off of my, you can clean the resin off by doing that. You can use a cleaning solution on the surface for, you know, any thin stuff and scrub it off. Just again, you know, when you're cleaning your cups or you're cleaning your molds, don't do it in the sink because you don't want those bits of resin to get gathered up with anything else that's in your drain. Like, you know, for me, I've got long hair, so hair's everywhere, right? You don't want it to get caught up in that and just cause a major clog, especially, oh my gosh, water-based resin. Okay, so you know, you want to think, oh well, it's just water-based stuff, I can go clean it in my faucet. Well, that stuff hardens, so then you now have all of this cement-like stuff settling in your pipes somewhere, so you sure don't want to do that. Okay, I think that's it. I hope some of this was helpful. Some of these things were things that I learned as I was going along. Another thing, when the resin's soft like this, you can take scissors and cut, you know, cut it out. If you wanted just to cut out a section. See how easy that is? Just cutting like cutting out paper. I'll use it, do the fussy cuts. This would be a piece of cake for you to cut something out like this. But you can just cut around it. And you can do this for quite a while after it's demolded. It takes a little bit for it to get super, super hard. So you could cut out, you know, different pieces. You'll see if you look at any of my work that I'm always tearing apart molds and using sections of it and something else and creating something new with it. At any rate, thank you for watching. I hope you found it helpful. Hit like in the bottom if you found this the least bit helpful, and I will see you next time. Thank you.